Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's MDICx webinar. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I'm the Program Director for MDIC's Science of Patient Input Initiative. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is part 3 in our 3-part series, From Stories to Evidence, Quantitative Patient Preference Information to Inform Product Development and Regulatory Reviews. We're excited to have back again Reed Johnson and Juan Marcos Gonzalez from Duke University School of Medicine. They'll be taking us through part 3 of our series today, and we'll be focusing primarily on analysis of patient preference data. As always, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat box. We also have with us Heather Benz from CDRH. She'll be able to answer any questions you may have about regulatory applications of patient preference information. So with that, I will turn it over to Juan Marcos.
Actually, thank you, Stephanie. Actually, Reed Johnson is going to be starting the presentation this afternoon. Do I have control?
Sorry, let me do that one more time.
Just want to make sure I have control.
Okay, looks like you do.
Okay. Well, I've been looking forward to this third webinar because the only people who have dialed in today are people who are really interested in the topic. I don't have to deal with the stress of having to persuade people that this is important stuff. So you all have sort of indicated your strong interest today. Today we're going to focus on more of the analytical aspects of quantifying patient preference, quantifying patient preferences. I should say that Shelby joined us in the previous 2 webinars, but today she's occupied with another meeting. Okay, so what we are focusing on specifically is the question of patients' tolerance for treatment risks. That is, in particular, how much risk are people willing to bear in return for better efficacy? The answer to this question is important for regulatory reviews. It is the problem that all benefit risk assessments face after questions of data quality and clinical trial design and all of those matters have been resolved and discussed. Ultimately, we have outcomes that are measured in different units, and subjective weights have to be attached to the relative importance of those different outcomes. Now, we have in the past generally relied on regulators to provide those subjective judgments, but increasingly, FDA and other regulatory agencies are turning to patient preference information to help resolve that. So, we have the problem of comparing apples and oranges. I borrowed this slide from the late, great Bernie O'Brien. Bernie said that in order to compare apples and oranges, you need bananas. And standard gamble, which is a way of quantifying utility weights, requires that respondents identify a probability P that makes them indifferent between a lottery between apples and bananas or getting oranges with certainty. So they have to give you a P for the value of that lottery that would make them indifferent between the lottery itself and getting oranges for free. This is a very difficult question to ask. It is treated as the gold standard for identifying utility weights for comparative effectiveness analysis, but it is an extremely difficult question, and it requires a very strong assumption that looks like this. Oh, sorry, we have to replace the fruit with a lottery between perfect health and instantaneous painless death. Now, the other problem is that there's no such thing as perfect health, and there's no such thing as instantaneous painless death. So not only are we asking patients to answer a difficult, it's called a matching task, but we're also asking them to evaluate a lottery over implausible and clinically irrelevant outcomes. In addition, we have to make an assumption here about the structure of utility. So the specification here is that the utility of asthma, the health state utility weight for asthma, is the weighted sum of the utility of perfect health multiplied by the probability of getting perfect health, and the utility of instantaneous painless death multiplied by 1 minus that probability. If we attach to the utility of perfect health, just assume that that has a value of 1, and the value of instantaneous painless death is 0, then that weighted sum is just P. That is, the health state utility for asthma is the P that people give you when they answer the standard gamble question. So why not use standard gamble? Well, it is widely used. The problem about using standard gamble as a means of assessing risk preferences for regulatory assessments is that it doesn't identify risk preferences. It assumes risk neutrality, that multiplying P times the utility of perfect health plus 1 minus P times the utility of death is contrary to the fact that people that the expected utility is less than the probability times the outcome for technical reasons, economic theory, because of diminished margin utility. And the evidence of that is that people buy insurance. They wouldn't buy insurance if they weren't risk averse, because it would make no sense. The probability that they're going to recover their premiums over the life of the policy is very low. So it assumes also that preferences are linear in probabilities, but it turns out, and we learned from what's called prospect theory, which was one of the foundations of what is now called behavioral economics, is that in fact expected utility involves weighting probabilities, and I'll show you an example of that. The other thing that we have learned from decision science is that risk characteristics other than probability matter. People care about the risk in different ways. That is, the two things that have the same probabilities may be treated very differently in terms of preferences, depending on characteristics such as how familiar people are of the risk, whether they perceive that there are things they can do to avoid the risk, and whether the risk is imposed on them by other people or whether it's a result of voluntary decisions. They're also concerned about latency. That is, outcomes that occur later in the future are regarded quite different than outcomes that are earlier in time. And there's a question not only of instantaneous painless death, but the quality of life at the end of life that could influence people's preferences for bearing risks, mortality risks. So we have today going to have to sacrifice simplicity in the interest of rigor, as we'd like to, in what we do with patient data, impose the fewest possible assumptions a priori and just let people's preferences say whatever they say. So here is a quick test of the standard gamble assumptions. It was applied to Crohn's disease. This was a study that we did as part of a group of studies on Tysabri 8 or 9 years ago now. We elicited preferences between improved outcomes for Crohn's disease and PML risk. We estimated a model that Juan Marcos will talk a little later about how you do that, but the results were for a categorical model where we impose no assumptions on the functional form. We just estimate a parameter for each of these three levels. 0.005, I think this is for a 10-year risk, 0.02, 2% risk or 5% risk. Now, the first thing we notice is that the quality assumption of a straight line, that is, we're just multiplying outcomes by probabilities, is rejected here. This is not a linear function of these levels. So we explored use of a weighted utility function, first proposed by Tversky and Kahneman as part of their prospect theory development. This was originally was proposed for financial risks, but when we use the functional form that they suggest for weighted risk preferences, we get a curve that fits our actual empirical functional form almost perfectly. Okay, so we have recently done a PCORI study where we estimated QALYs based on conventional health state utilities for anti-TNF treatments versus prolonged corticosteroids for inflammatory bowel disease. I'm sorry, I did not replace this slide. I thought I had fixed the slide. Actually, the QALYs are in years, because 0.81 makes no sense as months. But the patient preference weighted durations are in months. So you can multiply the 0.01 times 12, which gives us 0.12 for the difference in QALYs versus 1.9 for patient preference weighted durations using without imposing any of the quality assumptions that I've just been talking about. It makes a big difference if we use patient preferences, elicit patient preferences using techniques that in fact are respectful of people's actual attitudes and preferences with regard to risk rather than the artificial assumptions required by QALYs. Well, Marcos is going to tell you all about how to quantify.
Yeah. So hopefully you've seen with these examples that how you analyze the data beyond what methods you use to generate the patient preference data, how you analyze those data matters, and it matters in a way that may be clinically meaningful. So so the purpose of the rest of the presentation today is to kind of take you through the different steps that you need to complete in order to conduct a responsible and rigorous analysis of different kinds of stated preference data. And so the first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to try to provide a bit of a framework that allows you to understand how the different stated preference methods that are available to collect or elicit patient preferences collect that information and what those data look like. We obviously encourage everyone who is conducting a study like this to start by thinking about the data that you're getting and what these data are telling you. And so going back to something that I believe we presented in one of the previous sessions, you can imagine that in a benefit-risk evaluation, you're going to be comparing different profiles of treatments or medical interventions. And so these profiles have sort of a technical relationship between benefits and risks, and that we take as given. It is revealed by the clinical trial data. But in addition to that technical relationship, we acknowledge that there's a preferential relationship. That is a relationship that establishes how each of those combinations affect respondents' well-being. And we call that level of well-being utility, which is something that Reed mentioned before. Unfortunately, in this literature, the concept of utility is used in various ways. So I'm just going to ask you to accept the use of utility here as I'm presenting it, just as a measure of well-being when people take a specific medical or undergoes a specific medical intervention. And so the height, that utility measure is measured in a different dimension. And so if you think about this very stylized example that I'm presenting here, two profiles, you can imagine that each of these profiles, combining a specific level of benefit and risk, is going to be associated with a different level of utility or well-being. And so the relative height of these different profiles is what's going to give us information about relative preferences. The greater the gap or differences between these, the greater the differences between these different profiles, the greater the intensity of preferences for one profile over the other, okay? So the question that we're trying to answer as we run or conduct these studies, and specifically when we try to analyze the data that is generated by stated preference instruments, is how do we uncover that relationship? How do we quantify that difference between profiles? And perhaps more importantly, not only how do we quantify those relationships, but at what point do these bundles, the benefits and risks, are associated with the same level of utility, okay? And this is a very important point which we call equivalence between profiles, because in essence that profile is what gives us, that equivalence is what gives us that measure of risk tolerance that is going to be useful in the benefit-risk evaluations of clinical trial data. And there are different ways in which we consider this equivalence a measure of risk tolerance. The first way that is widely used in the literature is what we call maximum acceptable risk. So to understand maximum acceptable risk and the link of that concept with this equivalence picture that I'm showing here, I'll ask you to imagine that you are currently taking the profile characterized by point A, which provides utility A associated with that profile. And I'm asking you now to consider that you could switch to profile B, right? If profile B is associated with the exact same level of utility, in principle, you ought to be indifferent between staying where you are, assuming everything else is constant, of course. You should be indifferent between staying where you are or moving to this new treatment, okay? However, understanding that we have a strong prior that risks associated with any treatment are going to have a negative effect on the value of that treatment or on the well-being that is derived from that treatment. Increasing the risk level in that profile B, given where it currently is going to be expected to reduce that level of utility, right? And as you reduce that level of utility, then switching from profile A to profile B it becomes a proposition that will not and should not be accepted by patients. At the same time, if we reduce the risk of profile B and we expect that that will increase the utility of that profile, then moving from profile A to profile B becomes a very enticing option. So you can see how that threshold of equivalence really separates two states in terms of how people make decisions and how people consider a specific profile of benefit and risk acceptable, right? So any risk level that is above the risk level that maintains this equivalence is considered to break that equivalence and in a negative way, so it would not be acceptable. And any risk level that is below that threshold value is considered to improve the appeal of profile B, and hence it makes profile B more acceptable. The same can be said with efficacy if you were to fix the risk level at any particular level. So if you were to change the benefits expected from profile B here, except that the directionality is the opposite, right? So any benefit above the level that you see here as maintaining these equivalents is going to be making B more appealing, hence is going to be expected to be acceptable. Any benefit below that threshold is going to make B less acceptable. And so we call these thresholds, the first one, as I said before, maximum acceptable risk, because anything below it is acceptable, anything above it is not. And the second measure, which is entirely related, as I hopefully was able to communicate here with this example, we call minimum acceptable benefit because it is, in essence, the minimum level of efficacy that would achieve at least this indifference level, okay? Now, it's important to note that these equivalences or thresholds that we've characterized here are not related directly to the attitudes that Reid was explaining before about risk neutrality, risk tolerance, or risk aversion. Those are attitudes that are taken as given in any analysis of this sort. And so what those would do is that they would change the points where these indifferences take place. Okay, now I'm going to use this little framework to explain how each of the different families of methods that are available to explain or elicit stated preferences get at this very same information. Okay, there's a large number of methods available out there to elicit preferences. In fact, there's a big effort right now and it's been for a while, to kind of build a taxonomy that helps us organize what each method is doing and the strengths and weaknesses of each method. This specific taxonomy that you see here is taken from the IMI Preferred Group. It's an EU-sponsored study looking at sort of cataloging the different methods available. The first one of these methods is the Discrete-Choice based technique. Then we have the threshold-related techniques, rating-related techniques, and ranking-related techniques. I'm going to go through each one of those now rather quickly, just to explain again in this framework how they're collecting the preference information. So this is a choice question. This is a discrete choice experiment. And here we ask respondents to consider 2 or 3 multiple different profiles that are designed experimentally. And we collect information on which of these options is preferred by each individual, right? And so we change the characteristics that they're evaluating experimentally, and we can tally that information in terms of the choices that people make for A and B, and the frequency with which they choose each profile tells us is assumed by economic theory and cognitive psychology that is related to the relative height of these profiles, right? Now, we generate a design experimentally so that we can actually have enough of these points and ask people to evaluate enough of these points so that we can actually build a surface. So we can actually get the relative height of a lot of points and enough information to infer what the height of the points that were not included would be, okay? And with that information, because we are generating it experimentally, we can, after the fact, evaluate what would need to change in terms of benefits and risks from the profiles that were presented in order to achieve that equivalence that I presented before. So the actual product of these data is just the relative height of the different profiles based on the frequency of choice. We infer indifference based on how much we know about the relative height of these profiles. The second method is our family of methods are called threshold-based methods. And what they do is that they don't try to get to the relative heights of any given profile. They actually are trying to evaluate the indifference directly. And so they present a scenario that might consider of benefits, risks, and any other set of attributes. And then they iteratively ask respondents to accept or reject tweaks to that scenario, where the tweaks are made based on either benefits or risks. And so based on the respondent and the response to the initial tweak, the design adjusts the level of risk or benefit presented. And again, it sort of ping-pong the respondent to a point of indifference. So in this, again, the framework that we've defined here, this is sort of what we would have. We would start at 2 different points and slowly iterate towards this point of indifference. The third method is a rating method, and here we're showing just an example, which is a swing weighting method. And here we ask people to provide the values directly for the sort of the height that they expect to associate with specific changes in attributes. Normally in swing weighting, people start by stating what's the most important attribute or change in an attribute and assign that a 10 or some sort of normalized value, and then evaluate any other category where they assign the points that they think reflect the proportion of the height of those states vis-a-vis the most important state, okay? So here, we're not even getting at the value of profiles, considering benefits and risk. We're actually eliciting those data, that information separately. But again, because we're getting information on the relative height of risks and perhaps benefits, you can then infer what would be the point at which the two attributes would be considered to be equivalent. The fourth method is ranking, and we typically use this as a way to extract more choices than we otherwise would. In other words, we ask people to rank items over others, and if we record that someone, for example, ranked item 1, which may be a benefit or a risk, over other items, then we kind of assume that if they were to make a choice between that item and item 2, 3, and 4, they would choose item 1 over those, okay? So in a way, even though the elicitation here is different, the information that you're getting is very similar to the choice-based example that I presented earlier with discrete choice experiments. And then there are all these creative ways of combining these different sources of preference information. This is just one example, what we call a graded pair question, where in essence you present a setup that really mimics what you have with a choice-based method. But instead of asking people to choose, you ask them to give you some sort of rating, relative rating of how likely they would be to select one over the other, or prefer one over the other, right? And so some of this is trying to create questions that take the best of certain methods and minimize the downsides of other methods. So in this case, for example, you ask people to answer these questions based on these profiles, which are more difficult to answer strategically because you're not asking about any profile that is perhaps clinically available. These are hypothetical scenarios. And you can also, because you're asking them to consider full profiles, you can also ask them to consider interaction effects across these different attributes. But on the other hand, you still need an experimental design, and you have all the baggage, I guess, of the DCE, except that you get a little bit more information because you're not only getting choice, you're actually getting intensity of preferences here. Okay, so now I'm going to let Reed talk a little bit about what to do once you get your data.
We have some high aspirations here, and that is to turn patient stories into evidence. That is something that looks to clinicians like real data that they could use to inform an evidence-based decision. And in order to do that, we have to be able to establish the validity of the data that we have obtained. Now, from the, let's take a look at various, actually, this is Juan Marcos's slide. This is supposed to be over between bring and data. I'm not sure why it slipped over. But what we're looking for is good data, not just data. So there are some established metrics for validity. One is, does it make sense based on what we know already? The second is, are we really measuring what we say we're measuring? Third is, can we actually use our data to predict what people actually would do? The next one, whatever I am on here for, is our measure consistent with measures produced by others? I've never been especially impressed by convergent validity since if you're comparing a good measure against a bad measure, what have you learned? Nevertheless, it is comforting and reassuring when doing things in two different ways produces similar results. If they produce dissimilar results, I'm not sure what to make about that. And then finally, external validity, which is, can we generalize the results, and is it powerful enough to be consistent with, that is the hypothetical choices that we obtain, if that's actually consistent with what we call revealed preferences. Okay. In stated preference methods, our assessments of validity, by and large, are guided with Von Marquis's little introduction to theory. That is, in economics, we have a utility theory which imposes some reasonable, very weak assumptions on people's preferences, and then checks to see whether what we observe people saying and doing is consistent with tests of just basic logic and consistency. Because we generally do not have revealed preference data to compare to stated preference data for good reasons, it's unethical to run experiments like we run in stated preference surveys in a clinical setting. We have to rely pretty heavily, at this point at least, on internal validity tests. Okay, so let's focus then on this internal validity perspective and see what we can obtain from stated preference data that could be used to evaluate face validity, content validity, and predictive validity. Okay, so one thing we're concerned about is when respondents take too little time or too much time to complete the survey. That is, we design surveys to take, let's say, 20 minutes, and respondents who take 4 minutes, we're a little skeptical that they have devoted enough attention to the task. And people who take 2 hours, maybe they just had to prepare dinner for the family, but if they were contemplating answers to these questions and it took them that long to answer 8 to 12 questions, then we suspect that they're not really doing the task the way that we intended. One indication also that of inattention is straight lining. That is that they always pick, say, if there are 2 alternatives, A and B, they always pick A. It's very unlikely that the A would always have the greater utility of the 2. Or any other sort of patterns would make us suspicious. There can be comprehension issues, and there are ways for us to test whether people really understood the way that we provide define the outcomes and the task that we asked to use, one of either rating, ranking, or choice. Content validity can be measured in some pretty straightforward ways. I'll show you an example of each of these. Transitivity is kind of a gold standard for rationality in utility theory, but rarely is used because it imposes some requirements on the experimental design, some inefficiencies on the design. Then, just repeating the same question twice is a good internal test of predictive validity. And then just the internal consistency. We can measure the actual variance of the pattern of choices. If people are not being internally consistent, then the variance increases. Let me show you some actual examples. Here's a stability test failure. So in, say, question 2, we have treatment A and treatment B. We have efficacy, side effects, and cost. This is obviously just a little tinker toy example. This isn't an actual survey. So we have good, excellent, moderate, mild, $10 or $100 the respondent looks at these and chooses treatment A. Now, in question number 6, we offer them exactly the same choices, but then in question 6, they say, I think I'll pick B instead. That's a test-retest failure. The assumption that we're imposing here is that people's preferences are not going to change between question 2 and question 6. That seems like a fairly weak assumption. Better do this. Within set monotonicity, within our group, I'm sorry, but we call this the bozo test. That is, anybody, even bozo, could read this and everybody would agree, no matter what their preferences are. Why do they agree? Because treatment A is not as good as treatment B. That is, it only has good efficacy, but treatment B has excellent efficacy. The side effects for treatment A are moderate, but for treatment B, they're mild. And for costs, they're $100 a month instead of $10 a month. So anybody who's paying any attention would pick B, but this person picked A. So that's a test of, the technical term is within set monotonicity. The term we use is the bozo test. Cross-set monotonicity is exactly the same as the bozo test, except it happens in a more similar, but it works again in 2 different questions instead of the same question. So let's suppose we've got excellent, mild, and 100, which is treatment B. That appears both in question 2 and in question 6. In treatment A, you've got good is the same and $10 a month is the same, but the difference here is in side effects. In this case, treatment A had moderate side effects. Treatment A is better than, in question 6, is better than it was in question 2, but suddenly they prefer treatment B, even though they could have chosen treatment B in question 2 if they really preferred it. But even when we offer them a bigger distance between the utility of A and B, they should like A even better if they picked it in question 2, but now they switched, which is inconsistent. Here's the transitivity test. It's a little complicated, but all it is simple logic. This guy prefers treatment A to treatment B in question 2. Now we show treatment B against treatment C. So it prefers A to B, prefers B to C. So if he prefers A to B and B to C, he must prefer A to C. But this guy, instead of preferring A to C, he prefers C, which is inconsistent with what he's already told us. The problem with this is that this is an inefficient experimental design. So we use up some opportunities to collect meaningful preferences to put in a triplet like this, which doesn't really tell us anything more about preferences than if we just asked 2 questions. Preference domination. This actually is unfortunately quite common in our surveys, and let me show you what is going on. Here, the respondent compares, let's see, I just want to make sure it's efficacy, right?
Yes.
Yeah. This person is always going to choose the attribute that has the better efficacy. So in the first one, the respondent picks excellent. In the second, he also picks excellent. And in the third, he picks good. And it turns out that pattern suggests that the respondent is paying no attention to the other attributes. They're just focusing on one attribute. Now, it is a little suspicious that they're picking the first attribute. That is, if they're just trying to get through the survey as fast as they can so they can collect their $5 incentive, then it would be simple just to pick on the basis of the first attribute. Or a competing hypothesis is that this person really, really cares about efficacy, and we never show them values of anything else. For example, they're picking excellent here, even though it's going to be $100 a month. Well, what if it had been $150 a month or $250 a month? Then, at some point, it might be that they would have traded back to A, but we never show them a price that's high enough to discourage them from picking the better efficacy level. So unfortunately, we record this as a failure, but it is possible that it's an artifact of our study design where we just never show people trade-offs that encourage them to trade away from their very strongly preferred attribute. All right. There is another kind of validity test that we haven't mentioned in the previous slide called the scope test failure. There's a little historical note here that I was involved in a study in environmental economics, I don't know, 25 or 30 years ago, that established the scope test as a validity standard in stated preference research. So here's the problem. Split the sample in half and show the risk levels for group 1 will be 0.3%, 0.8%, and 1%. For group 2, they're going to see 0.8%, 1%, and 3.5. So group 1 never sees 0.3, and group 2 never sees 3.5, but they overlap on 0.8 and 1%. Now we estimate the same model, except separate models for the two different groups, and we get some disturbing results here. It ought to be the case, let's see, is this right? Yes. So the difference between the 3.5 and 3.3% is almost a 3% change in risk in terms of preference weights. In terms of preference weights, they evaluate almost 3% change in risk. But here, it looks like a 0.7% change in risk has exactly the same change in utility, which makes no sense. So the way we explain this behavior is that respondents are recoding the levels to high, medium, and low, or low, medium, and high. And it doesn't really matter which numbers we show them. Group 1 is recoding 0.3% as low, 0.8 is medium, and 1% is high. And group 2 is recoding 0.8% as low, 1% is medium, and 3% as high. So it really wouldn't matter what numbers we showed them, they would respond the same way. Now, we could either throw away the data because it fails a scope test, which is really a basic standard for whether people are really paying attention, or we could analyze the data. Okay, I got ahead of myself here. So let me just emphasize here that both of them evaluated 0.8% and 1%, and we really ought the difference between those two should be exactly the same, and they're not. Now, this is a study of Juan Marcos's. We talked about dominating on a single attribute. There's a statistical technique to look at the opposite problem. That is that people who are inattentive to some attribute. Obviously, people who dominate on one are inattentive to everything, but it may be that people are paying less attention to some attributes than others. So it's possible to identify people who appear to be recoding. And when he did that, this is what happened. I didn't realize that I'm using his slide here. We get exactly the same estimates for 0.8% and 1%. But of course, the first group also evaluated something lower than that, and the other group evaluated something higher than that. And this is perfectly now consistent with a scope. It was passes the scope test. That is, once we control for the people who are recoding, there are enough people left who are not recoding to pass the scope test. So there can be, in some cases, analytical techniques to deal with identifying people who are failing a test and then controlling for them statistically to correct our results. All right, so that suggests that we need to take a little, apply a little caution to the interpretation of internal validity failures. We don't really want to encourage just counting up the number of failures as an overall quality score for the data. It's possible that apparent failures are really a valid, provide valid information about preferences. For example, this question about attribute domination, is it a result of inattention, or is it actually information about people who have strong preferences for that particular attribute? Another form that domination can take, this is the straight lining thing, is if there is, if respondents are always choosing or always rejecting a constant status quo alternative, there may be some interesting reasons for why they're doing that. In a recent study of ours, we found that respondents who were evaluating a chronic fatal disease had a larger propensity to pick the active intervention as opposed to just avoiding any risks by staying with the status quo. And we sort of, completely independently of the attributes of the active intervention, they tended to pick it disproportionately. We call this a labeling effect. That is, they were attaching value to the label apart from the attributes. And we interpret that as a kind of a value of hope. That they're just hoping that any sort of active intervention is going to work for them. It is possible that the failures the validity failures are an indication of survey design problems. It is not a failure of the respondent, but it's a failure of the researcher. It may be that the attribute definitions were ambiguous, unclear, incomplete, too long. That is, you just didn't do a very good job of setting people up to do the trade-offs. It's also possible that characteristics of the respondent result in failure. Older respondents with lower educational attainments, we're asking them to do really, in choice experiments, a pretty difficult task. It may be that respondents who are frail, who have very severe conditions, just have a hard time concentrating for 20 minutes to take the survey. And we've already mentioned that unusually short or unusually long survey times are a pretty clear indication of there's something going on wrong in the way the respondent is processing the choice task or the rating or ranking task. So there are lots of statistical things that we can do to evaluate the failure data. We gave you an example for a scope test. We would want to test the sensitivity of the preference weights to including or excluding respondents who failed one or more validity tests. We often find that there are so few respondents who fail these tests that it doesn't make a meaningful change in the parameter estimates. We can use latent class analysis to identify and isolate groups that have questionable response patterns. That was the example we used for the scope test. There's an attribute non-attendance modeling, which is just another a different flavor of latent class analysis. Okay, I don't have time to really talk about a test or a study that we recently completed for the Center for Devices, where we provide, I can go quickly, we provided a program, a Microsoft app that we coded in our group to a long list of researchers who had published choice experiments in the last few years, and asked them to apply the program to their data sets. We have no idea what the application was. The program just looks for these patterns that we were talking about and checks how many times they observed failure, and then we asked them to send the summaries back to us. We just submitted the manuscript on this, but here's just a summary of how often these different tests appeared different numbers of times in the various studies. So transitivity only appeared 3 times because you really had to do something in the experimental design to, and most people didn't do that. The attribute dominance is the most frequent thing, and this will have, you can observe this in any choice data set, regardless of its experimental design. You don't have to do anything special. You just observe that some people are always picking based on one attribute. We set the cutoff at 70, that they were picking the better level of one attribute at 75%, which is completely arbitrary, but we got 22% on average. About 1/5 of the sample was failing the attribute dominance test. That was the actually we got a surprisingly large failure on stability. It turns out that if the longer the interval between the first and the second question, this is the repeated question. If you follow it immediately after, then almost everybody passes. If you ask it at the beginning and the end, you get lots of people failing. And we believe that is because people at the beginning of the choice sequence are just kind of trying to figure out what you're asking them to do. And at the end, they're getting pretty tired and their attention begins to flag. So we think that the best way to set up this test is to randomly repeat 2 questions so that the intervals vary randomly. We didn't really check how they applied this, but it is pretty common that people would repeat put the repeated question towards the end of the sequence. That may be why we get 30%. Okay, so the 3 studies that included transitivity had no people who failed, and I'm going to move on. Okay, back to one, Marcus.
Thank you, Reed. So hopefully now you have a sense of what should be your first step as you get data from really any type of stated preference method. The examples that we presented here are all related to Discrete-Choice experiments, and frankly, some of the tests that we discussed here are primarily applicable to Discrete-Choice experiments, but not all. And so, regardless, the message here is that there are tools to measure the quality of the data through these internal validity measures and tests, and so we encourage people to do that, of course, as they are analyzing their data. Now, when it comes to options to analyze your data, you have your data, you've checked that it's good data, it behaves reasonably in terms of the different internal validity measures that we discussed. And then it comes the time to start analyzing these. As we said before, there are families of methods. Because of the quality and the information each method provides, the alternatives to analyze these data vary by the different families that I mentioned earlier. Threshold-based methods, because they get directly to the threshold or this indifference point, you could actually get away with a pretty simple analysis. You get in principle, every respondent could have their own threshold. And so you may just need to summarize the basic statistics, what is the distribution of that threshold. Or you could correlate that with a regression analysis with personal characteristics. You're in essence asking the respondent to do more of the work for you as they're answering the question as opposed to you doing it after you get the preference information. In rating-based methods, the same is true because you get, again, individual level responses. You could just use basic statistics or again, relate the equivalence measures that you get for each respondent to the individual characteristics through correlation analysis or regression analysis. And then the choice-based and ranking-based methods, because as I said before, they're kind of the same in terms of how we analyze them. they require pretty much the same tools, which are pretty sophisticated statistical analysis tools. And I'm going to focus on those right now. Very important to mention that there have been several efforts to try to code sort of good practice when it comes to analysis. The ISPOR task force was released in 2015, I believe. They have several task force reports. This one was specifically about good practices for the analysis of discrete-choice experiment data. And it's a great document to go through. It explains how the results in these models or these methods can be interpreted. How do you characterize heterogeneity of preferences, and it also sort of provides a guide to evaluate model fit as you're trying to see or test different specifications of things like risk, as Reed mentioned earlier, where you can assume that risk has different functional forms, and you will need to evaluate how do you know which functional form is most appropriate. There are 4 primary methods to analyze discrete-choice experiment data. The first one is sort of the basic approach. It is the original approach developed by McFadden, won him the Nobel Prize in the year 2000 in economics. It is sort of an analog of a linear model, except that it takes into account the fact that you are modeling choices which are discrete and bounded between 0 and 1. Everything else sort of builds on what conditional logits do to try to accommodate different flavors of heterogeneity and preferences. So very important, and the reason why conditional logit is usually not considered a final model when analyzing these data is that conditional logit makes a fairly strong assumption that everyone answering the choice questions has the same preferences. And any variability that you observe in the patterns of responses across respondents is just assumed to be error, okay? And so because of that, and because we have a strong prior that it's not the case, we often use it sort of as a first step to kind of look at the general behavior of the data and making sure that things are working properly. But we typically move right along to methods that allow us to evaluate heterogeneity and preferences. That is, methods that don't necessarily assume that everyone feels the same way about the benefits and risks presented. And one of the go-to methods is this random parameter or mixed logit. It relaxes the assumption that everyone has the same preferences. And it does so because we collect multiple responses by individual, right? And so we can actually use the individual level patterns to inform how different any given individual is expected to be from the overall average preferences that we elicit. So we are still kind of targeting what is the average preference value for the population, and heterogeneity is described in terms of deviations from that average. You need to make some assumptions about how you expect variability will look like. So are we looking at variability in preferences that look like a normal distribution? So you have equally a number of people feeling that their preferences are more extreme in the positive end of that curve as they are in the negative end of that curve. And there are a variety of options to change the different taste characteristics. And the model basically, again, focuses on the mean, which means the mean preferences, which means you get a mean estimate for preferences for each one of the attributes considered in the study, and I'm going to give you an example in a little bit of how these look. And then a standard deviation measure, so just the dispersion, some sense of the dispersion of preferences. It assumes that the preferences or the distribution of preferences is continuous, meaning that there are sort of infinite number of groups out there, and that every respondent can be ever so slightly different from the others, so that you can build an infinite number of preference profiles in the population. This is what a typical mixed logit results look like. If you were considering a study evaluating efficacy, side effects, and mode of administration, this is a very simple stylized example. It actually comes from a task force report. You can get parameter estimates, which we call here coefficients. These are mean estimates, and these are the numbers that I showed you before in the figure, the plot that I was trying to use to characterize utility, right? The relationship between benefits and risks. These would be the numbers that would go in there. And these numbers right here, which are the standard deviations, just give you an indication of how heterogeneous preferences were for each one of the means that you've estimated with the model. The second approach is to use a hierarchical-based model, and it's very similar actually to the random parameters mixed logit model, except that it goes about estimating results in an opposite way. As I said before, mixed logit sort of focuses on the mean and evaluates, takes individual level information to just evaluate deviations from the mean. Hierarchical-based does this the other way around. It actually estimates individual level preferences and then calculates the overall mean based on these estimated individual level preferences. And so it uses this iterative approach where people who contribute little information on certain attributes are able to borrow information from the overall means. And so you start with individual level information, you produce overall means, and those overall means inform the preferences that you're calculating for certain respondents, which again influences the overall mean, and you can see how the cycle kind of keeps going, iterating until it converges to a system that is stable. Even though it's less frequently used than mixed logit, hierarchical-based appeal has been increasing in recent years for various reasons. The results, not surprisingly, are not terribly different between the random parameters logit and the hierarchical base. These are sort of mean estimates in this mock data. You can see that the parameter estimates are pretty similar. Where they could vary more significantly is in the way they're measuring standard deviation, and it's because of the way the model processes data, and perhaps partly because the convergence, final convergence criterion that is used to get to output the results. Finally, you can completely forget about this idea that there are this infinite number of classes or groups out there in your sample, and you can make the assumption that perhaps there is a discrete number of groups that behave more or less equally, and that may be 2, 3, 4, 5 groups, right? And so there is this method called latent class or finite mixture logit model that in essence allows you to do that. It again takes the patterns of responses that you observe for each individual, and it classifies probabilistically respondents to different classes, different groups that you have predetermined. And so it optimizes the analysis so that you get the results for each class. In this case, in this example, we can assume, say, a 2-class system. It optimizes the search for the results so that you're both optimizing class assignment, the probabilistic class assignment, and the preference information that is gathered from each class. In other words, any information that you have from the choices that is helpful to determine class membership, and any information that you have once class membership has been determined probabilistically to determine the different preference weights for each class. And so the number of classes determine how many parameters you get. For each class, you basically get a separate set of preference weights. So you can see how the problem with this method could be that if you think there are 4 or 5 classes, you get a very large number of estimates that you need to get from the model. Okay. We're technically at time. I don't know if we can spend 5 to 10 more minutes to go over some examples, or if there are questions at this point. I think it'd be very appropriate to pause now and answer some of those questions.
If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box to type those in. I don't see any questions have come in yet, Juan Marcos, but I think we have some time if you'd like to continue with showing some examples, example applications. I'll wait for questions.
Sure, let's do that. So I'm going to let Reed start with some of the examples.
Well, we have been kind of been focusing on benefit-risk decision-making and how preference information could inform that. But we're not going to go into any detail of this, but the same sorts of approaches and considerations could inform decision-making at virtually any stage of the product life cycle. So in early stage, patient preferences can be used to inform decisions regarding commercial viability, patient needs, unmet needs. And this is kind of a prioritization use. In this case, you probably do not have to do a full-scale choice experiment, but could use perhaps a ranking approach just to identify the relative overall importance of things. It could also be used to help inform trial design. Often trial design is based on clinical considerations alone, but increasingly, both the Center for Devices and the Center for Drugs are asking whether there is a role for patient preferences in designing trials. And in that case, we would be trying to understand the level or rate at which endpoints are critical. And of course, that maps directly into effect sizes. At the next phase, we could be interested in relative importance of outcomes for, I forgot what TPP is.
Target product
population.
Profile.
Yeah, sorry. Target profile.
Target product profile.
Target product profile. Got it. We're kind of, yeah, I think we have an example of that a little later here if we have time. In this case, now we're beginning to be interested in questions of maximum acceptable risk, minimum required or acceptable benefit, and choice shares. That is, at least in our study population, if they were offered a particular choice of actual products, what proportion of those products would be chosen. At this point, we are interested in that threshold that Juan Marcos was talking about, which would identify a defensible benefit-risk trade-off. There is, in regulatory decision-making, there is considerable interest in case heterogeneity. That is, are there distinct subgroups? Are there groups that FDA sometimes calls early adopters, especially for devices? Can we identify that group and what their characteristics are and what their preferences are with respect to benefit-risk trade-offs? And this, of course, is the approval and reimbursement phase of things. So we are able, using more advanced methods, as Juan Marcos described, to identify important differences among stakeholders, which could then actually be used in a clinical setting. Our group is particularly interested in this right now, and we are working on a couple of approaches for doing this to support shared decision-making. We did a study, a prioritization study a number of years ago in Fragile X syndrome. This is a rare genetic condition resulting in developmental disabilities. This was an early stage, an early prioritization stage. We asked both clinicians and patient caretakers what their preferences were. We gave them exactly the same choice experiment and got some very interesting results. The most important attribute was control over behavior. It was more important than anything else. So the clinical and commercial perspective from the caregiver's perspective are plotted here. The clinical and commercial team had actually identified learn and apply new skills over here, and take part in new social activities over here as the most important endpoints. Those turned out to be basically the least important endpoints, or among the least important endpoints from a caretaker's point of view. In a recent study that we did on Alzheimer's, we offered a constant status quo alternative of what's going to happen to you if you don't take a medicine which could delay onset of symptoms. The other attributes are nausea, increased chance of disabling stroke, and increased chance of sudden death. And we asked, would you take no medicine or medicine in each of the questions? And we were able to calculate maximum acceptable risk. We found that there was significant risk tolerance for disabling stroke if you could offer 2 more years of normal memory. There was some variation, but no statistical differences among the, we had 2 age groups, the older age group and a younger age group. The younger age group was offered initially 4 years of normal memory, whereas the younger age group was offered 8 years of normal memory. We get no significant differences here. But we do get some differences. MIR decreases as the healthy lifespan increases. So when we offer 8 years of normal memory to this particular, to the younger group, there is, both for disabling stroke and sudden death, MIR decreases as the healthy lifespan decreases.
Okay. So this is sort of another example where it's actually a continuation of the AD, some of the AD work that Reed has been doing, where they applied latent class analysis to generate distinct groups within their sample. And what they found was that there were 3 distinct classes with sort of clinically meaningful characteristics. A class that was considered a trading class, where pretty much every attribute included had some degree of importance, a risk-averse class that clearly thought that anything related to risks was going to be most important, and then in sort of an AD-averse class, or Alzheimer's disease-averse class, which reacted very strongly both to the idea of facing the symptoms of dementia, and also the idea rejected very strongly the idea of not doing anything, not taking any medication. And so one of the things that I didn't mention before, but they have done here, is that then you can start not only look at the preferences across these groups, but also try to understand who is likely in each one of these groups, and try to understand what may be driving in terms of personal characteristics, the patterns of choices or the patterns of preferences that are observed in each class. As it relates to the TPP, it is often assumed that the company should include only a single, or consider a single target product profile, and it may be known or understood that that profile would be associated with a specific level of safety and efficacy. But there's no reason, understanding that preferences in terms of tolerance of risk vary by the benefit offered and vice versa, requirements of benefit vary by the risk level that you're asking the patient to bear. There's really no reason why you couldn't consider a continuum of TPPs that take into account, excuse me, the information that you have elicited about patients' willingness to accept different combinations of benefits and risks. And then finally, in the final example, another way in which preference information has been widely used is to kind of contrast the preferences of different stakeholders. This is a study that was conducted in the U.S. There was actually a Japanese component to this study as well, but it was conducted a while ago in atrial fibrillation. And here you can see we elicited preferences for both U.S. patients, atrial fibrillation patients, and atrial fibrillation well, they're treating physicians basically, and so we elicited the relative importance of all of these different outcomes, which are all related to clinical trial endpoints, and you can see here how there is a very important difference between the way physicians felt about death and disabling stroke relative to the way patients felt about that, those two outcomes as well. So again, it serves as a way to make these comparisons more transparent, make the differences in the judgments that people are making between different benefits and risks of treatment more transparent. And even if they don't necessarily inform benefit-risk evaluations, at least you can start understanding what might be different perspectives out there when it comes to evaluating benefit-risk profile of a product. Now that's it. We're happy to take questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Reed and Juan Marcos, and we do have time for a few questions.
Okay.
While we're waiting for a few questions, I do want to mention a couple of upcoming events that I think would be of interest to the audience here today and the folks we have on the line. Reed had mentioned the use of patient preference information across a number of different points in the medical product development life cycle, and one of those, MDIC has a project in one of those areas, specifically looking at patient preference information in clinical trial design. We'll be presenting the results of a 2-year collaborative study that we've done with FDA, RTI Health Solutions, MIT, and the Michael J. Fox Foundation. That's coming up on May 18th. For those of you that are going to be at the ISPOR conference, we'll also be presenting the results of that project during the panel presentation at ISPOR on May 22nd, which is Tuesday of the ISPOR conference. Our next MDICx webinar will be an update on CRH patient-centered initiatives. That's coming up on May 30th, and we'll have details up on the website soon. That's just now starting to be planned. We'll have details up in the coming days, and I will send an email. When I send the slides and the recordings from this week's webinar, I will include details about that upcoming webinar. There's also a patient-focused medical products development meeting in the area of sleep apnea coming up on June 8th, and this is a unique presentation in that it will be focused both on drugs and device products. So Juan Marcos, we do have a question coming in on one of the last result slides. I'm going to try and go back to the slide that she's referring to. Oops, this was probably not the best way to do it. I believe it's on these. So in the last result slide, LCA Class 2 showed mode of administration twice rather than efficacy, side effects, and mode as Class 1 showed. I think what she's referring to is this one here, maybe?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you can help explain that.
Yeah, no, it's very simple to explain, actually. There's a mistake in the labeling. That was an easy question, but thank you.
Sharp eye.
No, that's a very good point. The classes, we didn't mean to imply. Okay, actually, I'm gonna turn the question on its head, because in essence, you could, in principle, change what each of these classes is considering through your analysis. And actually, that is what this idea of attribute and attendance does. You can evaluate the data and just determine the number of classes you want to analyze or include in your analysis, and let the data tell you who's going to be where and what the preferences are going to be under each class. Or you also have the ability to impose what any of those classes will look like, and then let the model optimize the results so that it tells you who is going to be more likely to be in that specific class with the characteristics that you've imposed on it. So going back to the example of the scope test failure, what we did there is that we identified, or rather set up one of these classes so that we knew that one class was going to be behaving consistently with the scope test responses that we expected. So we imposed we made the requirement that one class met those criteria. And so then we let the analysis run, and what the latent class did then is that it told us who was most likely to be in that class, and by using that information, we were able to then elicit what preferences look like for those who are most likely to pass the scope test or behaving consistently with a scope test pass. But thank you. I mean, sharp eye, as Reed said, it's in this particular slide, that's a mistake. It should have said side effects, not mode of administration in the middle attribute for the second class.
Great. Thank you, Juan Marcos. Do we have any other questions from our audience?
Heather, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you. I think that what I want to emphasize here is the sort of menu of options that came up over the course of this conversation that I think was I hope was very helpful for participants to see the variety of validity considerations that may be considered when designing a study or when presenting the reliability or robustness of a study. But then also the variety of methods, some of which may be more relevant for one type of question and some of which may be best suited to address another type of question. And obviously, it's an ongoing conversation with the research experts and with the relevant review divisions at the FDA about, where a particular method would be most suitable. I do caution against writing any one method off completely, but certainly it's clear through our conversation today that that there are different considerations when applying different methods.
Great, thank you, Heather. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in. I want to thank our panelists, Reed and Juan Marcos, and thank you, Heather, for also joining. And thank you all for your participation in this great series. Slides and recordings from this webinar will be posted on the MDIC website in the coming days. Thank you all for joining us.